All right, good afternoon. Karen Erickson, Associate Executive Director of Alpha1 Foundation in the United States. I think in true Alpha1 form, and certainly Alpha1 Global, and wanting to be responsive to the needs of the audience, we have changed this afternoon panel. We've heard about lung disease, the future therapies, liver disease, the potential therapies, research in how to design it, how to become engaged in your community, how to build your organization, what it looks like to be incredible advocates and build the awareness, the detection, the access to care and therapy in the Alpha1 community. And we thought that the only thing we could finish with before you go into your groups with your individual countries and strategize and pull everything together was give you an opportunity to ask this panel of experts that has been extended to meet those needs. Also true in the global Alpha1 community, the success of you moving forward in your mission and your goals for the actions to take forward, it's going to demand your engagement, as will this discussion. We have an hour together, this panel of experts that I'll briefly introduce. You've heard their topics, but nothing's off the table. We'll direct them to the right person. So if you have anything on your mind, this is your time. Any recommendations? This is going to be a bit of a free-for-all, and we welcome that in the community and think that this was the best way to handle this session. So thanks for your acceptance of this little adjustment. We think it'll be beneficial. So I'm just going to go down the line here, and it's my pleasure again to welcome Elise Marguesa from Portugal, who's very active in the Alpha1 Association Portugal. Again, you heard yesterday on the expert liver panel that she is a mother of 3 children, 2 of which are alphas. One, her son, was transplanted. The other one is at a varying stage of symptoms. So thank you very much for your candor yesterday, and we appreciate you on the panel today. We were fortunate enough that I was able to capture Laura again from the EMA. It is a resource that communities like ours don't often get. She talked about some of the trials and the tribulations and the process in developing research and getting it through the regulatory bodies, something that we're all going to do as patient organizations as we partner with our healthcare professionals and allied healthcare professionals and the researchers in our community as patient participants, and again, taking that active seat at the table. So she'll bring us a wealth of information. Dr. Fragesi from the EMA, thank you again for staying. We have Dr. Luciano Corta. You have not heard him speak as a patient community. We've taxed him for a couple days in the clinical and the scientific forum, but he is a doctor of respiratory, in a respiratory specialty. He focuses on spirometry, detection, patient care, and we're really pleased to have him join us today. Shane Fitch, I don't think that anyone could have summarized where we need to go as a global community better than Shane did with her partner Frank over at this other table, who I'll jump to now. There's a lot that we need to do. There's a lot that we need to strategize. We have the correct people on the stage and in the audience here. Again, we all need that seat at the table to be very active in where we're moving forward in the most efficient and effective way to get our goals met. So Shane, thank you for your position on the steering committee for Alpha1 Global. It's been fantastic. Sandy Sandhouse is next in line, but I usually skip him, so I'm going to jump back to Frank Willerson right here. He is chair of the Alpha1 Global Steering Committee. He is from Belgium. You heard him talk about next steps. Again, between Shane and Frank's summaries and call to action today, I don't think any of us will leave this room without something to do. If you want to hone in on those ideas, they're certainly up here on the expert panel to open themselves up for that. Sandy Sandhouse. I've never met the man before, hardly know the name. Sandy Sandhouse talked to us yesterday about the therapies, novel therapies, and the future of lung disease therapy. In the United States, Sandy Sandhouse is the go-to clinical expert on Alpha1. He's a friend of the Alpha1 patients. I think he epitomizes where we want to get to globally with the relationship between our community and our physicians and the folks that serve us. He's been instrumental across the board in research, patient care, and an advocate for us. So welcome, Sandy Sandhouse, and thank you. Dr. Bruno Christ talked to us about his exciting stem cell research on our liver panel yesterday. He is a specialist in stem cell, and we welcome him again to the stage. John Walsh. I'd asked for a round of applause, but I don't even know that one's needed. Sits as the U.S. representative on the Alpha1 Global Steering Committee, is CEO of and co-founder of the Alpha1 Foundation. The list goes on and on with his inserting the Alpha1 message by building us into the COPD Foundation. Again, I could spend an hour up here, but it's always a pleasure to introduce John Walsh, and I thank you for your expert opinion. Last but not least, we heard about registries, a key component to our success in pushing research forward. Our registries make us so attractive to investigators globally, and that is where we've heard of so much great research and the pursuit of using Alpha1 in our community and its structure and our commitment as patients to participation. He runs the registry in Canada, but first and foremost, he is a physician, a pulmonologist, and dedicated to patient care. So Dr. Chapman, thank you again for being on the stage. I'm not going to start with any leading questions. I would welcome anyone here to elaborate a little bit more on their introduction, but I want to save the crux of this hour to open it up to all of you. Again, there's no question off the table. We'll sit up here and we'll talk for an hour, but we want this to be an interaction and a discussion and really pave the step forward. So anyone in the audience have a question for our esteemed guest? Thank you. And if we could wait till we get a mic, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you. First of all, Karen, I'd like to compliment you on operating at 120%. I'm very used to your pre-transplant at 110%. So thank you very much for being here.
I appreciate that, Ken. The check's in the mail.
I would like to address my question to Dr. Chapman, who I had the great privilege of meeting after his presentation at ATS in Philadelphia. Your presentation on the results of the study that proved what all of us know, that augmentation does, in fact, improve our quality of life and our lifetime. The question I have now is, what do we do with that report to make it even more beneficial to the Alpha community?
I'm glad you asked me about that in this public forum. It saves a lot of little one-on-one conversations that go like this. So that was a while ago. Where's the paper? And I mumble and stumble. The truth is, the paper has been accepted at one of those very large and prestigious journals, The Lancet. Oddly enough, The Lancet's not been very forthcoming about when exactly the paper will appear, so I'll just give you the approximate date of any day now. And I do know that it's going to be accompanied by a nice editorial, which describes this as a landmark paper and a landmark finding. So that's all wonderful news, and I'm sure we'll all want to go forward to payers or the powers that be to say, here it is, now let's have access. But I think we all know it won't be quite that simple. First of all, as you may recall from the earlier presentations, there was some discussion and negotiation about endpoints. The official scientific endpoint, which is given undue importance, I think, was a double-barreled endpoint, and the study didn't quite reach that. It did reach the intended endpoint, that is, the single intended endpoint that everybody had in mind when the study began 8 or 9 years ago. So that's going to be one little loophole that the payers, that the critics are going to try and exploit. The second issue is that it describes, of course, changes in lung density and the slowing of those changes. And I've certainly heard lung physicians who are not alpha physicians say, well, I don't want to treat x-rays. What do I care if the x-ray looks better? And so the doubting Thomases will also talk about the significance or lack of significance of CT scan changes. So, bottom line, the paper's going to appear any day now. It's new information. It's a great chance for us all to go to payers and regulators, and I'm afraid it's not going to be a slam dunk. It's game on.
Thank you. Do we have any other panelists that would like to comment on that? No? Great. Another question from the group here. Oh, fantastic.
maybe
Ferghese.
I can say something. You know, what we discussed in these days regarding augmentation therapy is also that, and this has been mentioned a number of times, and also Shane before touched briefly on health technology assessment. Basically, you know, when products get approved, that's not the end of the story. And actually, where you probably will find the most difficulties, particularly in Europe, where we have one centralized approval, but then we have each member state deciding by themselves, and even some regions within the same member states deciding on whether to reimburse or whether to make a product available to the population of the country or not. This is where probably this type of data can help, because they are data that are generated from real life experience, so from patients that are not in clinical trials but are treated also with other treatments. So it can, for example, help to show that the product works on top of what is already authorized. So just to give to the people who make the decision, this type of decision, the health technology assessment bodies, look a lot to what Jane mentioned this morning, that is cost effectiveness. So, and also what we call relative effectiveness. So my product works fine. We had a number of trials and worked versus placebo and so on. But what this is really adding, to the benefit of my population, for which I have to pay already so many medicines for diabetes, for this and for that. So you need to help the clinicians as much as you can. And this type of data of registries are very useful to these purposes, in my opinion, as well as any other data that can be generated in real life, so on patients that are not on trials, but actually that are taking other treatments as well. This is particularly useful also if it is not the case of the registry, I think, but if, for example, there were data about number of hospitalizations or this type of things. So these are the type of things you have also to think about when you think that you want to have a product in your country.
So from a patient perspective, inpatient patient perspective, I think Laura brings up a very good point. It's going to be up to us to fill in the gaps. It's going to be up to us in every country to get that health cost information, the disease burden information. So the surveys that the Alpha1 Global will create are going to be able to capture those data. Alpha1 Global fully intends to raise the resources to be able to support an HTA, a health technology assessment specialist, and specific strategic talent to plan country by country. And we'll use the basis of the toolkit, but each country it's going to be a little bit different. So it's up to us to make this data, the investment over $100 million in this study that will never be done again. There'll never be a double-blind placebo study of this magnitude ever again on augmentation therapy for Alpha-1. So we can't drop the ball, but we're not going to finish the game, as Ken said, with just the data being published in Lancet, and EMA probably even before the FDA will give it a nod and say, okay, we're going to have to fight the reimbursement battles country by country, and it's not going to happen unless everybody in this room organizes their national group and lobbies and advocates and pushes.
Just a clinical point of view, I would very interested about the surrogate markers of augmentation therapy as a clinician. So I would like to know, of course I ask to my patients, but the effect of augmentation therapy of a number of exacerbation, because the effect of augmentation therapy of quality of life, I know are secondary endpoint, but from the point of view of a patient and of a clinician as I am, I think it's very important to know more data. What do you think about
I can say that we certainly see reductions in those in the U.S. AlphaNet followed community. We see reductions in those kind of clinical endpoints like exacerbations, hospitalizations, ER visits, things like that. But I can't say that that's all due to being on augmentation therapy. Because among the things that happens when someone gets on augmentation therapy in the US, and probably in countries around the world, is they see a nurse every week to give an infusion who checks on their health. In the US, they're all enrolled in a health management program that educates them about Alpha-1 and the things to watch out for, how to rapidly respond to the first signs of an exacerbation, things along those lines. They all happen at the same time, and I'm willing to accept those improvements regardless of where they're coming from. Even in the US, where there has been augmentation therapy approved for marketing since 1987, there are still physicians who consider it an experimental therapy, an unproven therapy, and something like the rapid trials publication is going to go a long way to answering the questions that those physicians have, both in the US and around the world.
And one last quick concern, I think a battleground that's been a battleground for a while and is going to reappear is the notion of reserving augmentation therapy for rapid decliners, people who need it most. And I know Sandy shares my opinion, I think most of us do on the panel, that if you have obstruction, airways obstruction now with your Alpha-1, you're at risk of more obstruction in the future, and that warrants augmentation therapy. But there is a subpopulation of researchers and physicians who would rather monitor for a while and verify that things are getting worse before augmentation therapy. And I think we're going to see that story continue to unfold and have to be on the alert for it. There's nothing in the rapid trial that would suggest we should stand around and monitor decline. In fact, quite the opposite. The extension trial shows us that when people who've been for 2 years treated with placebo eventually do get true augmentation therapy, they never catch up and they never recover the lung function or the lung density that they've lost during those 2 years of placebo therapy.
I'd like to ask how to engage physician. I mean, obviously the Society of Patient is already here, and I believe that the 1,000-mile journey have already started. I come from a country where I'm a solo, and I don't even know how to engage public awareness. But since I'm sensing now after this conference that there is it's a worldwide issue that even physicians are not engaged, regardless of like political parties and laws about how to gather human pooled plasma, because I believe that people are dying for silliest reason, war or national or catastrophe. So how to engage physicians first, because this is the party that connects both political parties and patients. It's like coming from a scientific, documented, trusted people. So how to engage those people?
I'd offer one quick response is that we should almost give up on the physicians. They're unteachable. And yes, I know. Obviously, people in the audience have had experience of this. But I don't mean that facetiously. What I see unfolding in the modern era of delivering medicine is an elaborate set of care maps that can be well administered by non-physician healthcare practitioners. And I have great faith in the physician assistants, the nurse practitioners, the people who are going to follow the checklist. And so offer the quick example, at the diagnosis of COPD, on the checklist is screening for alpha. And the dedicated nurse practitioner in the respiratory center is going to see that that happens. And I think those are going to be the strategies that will bear most fruit. Physicians will eventually catch up when they see alpha patients appearing under their noses. But I think trying to engage their interest now is going to be a forlorn attempt, and I think the efforts are better elsewhere.
We're the foot soldiers. You know, we can walk into a physician's office easier than a pharmaceutical rep or anybody else, or not depend on a CME, a continuing medical credit course, for a physician or a medical school change in curriculum, we can walk in and give information about Alpha-1. We learn more from each other as alphas than we do from the healthcare profession. No offense to our favorite alpha docs up here. But there's no excuse why we can't do that ourselves. Philippe from Columbia, just at lunch, commented that he went to his physician when he got his diagnosis, the results of his tests, and his physician said, I don't know anything about Alpha-1, why don't you go find out and tell me? Well, that's a message, so we shouldn't be shy about that. We can be respectful. It's not some trivia off the internet. We've got, medical literature, peer-reviewed publications, information from American Thoracic Society, European Respiratory Society, standards of care document, and new standards coming out. Argentina has one in Spanish that could be used in Latin America. There's no excuse why we can't be the foot soldiers and go and deliver those messages and spend the time to talk with a physician or somebody in the physician's office about Alpha-1.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I agree with John on that point. I mean, you may have some off-putting situations early on, but sooner or later you will find a physician that's going to engage with you, particularly with what is now, very, very different situation from 15 years ago, as we all know. There's plenty of information published, physician level, regulatory level, standard guidelines, and at patient level. So I think it would be very difficult for a physician to ignore all that if it's put right in front of him. It's just the way you kind of approach, perhaps.
Right. And Shane, maybe you can comment, because it was such a pleasure for me to sit with such an incredible representative from Lebanon, and one who seems to have been in our wellness programs in the U.S. for so long that what she's done is almost picture perfect for the setup for success that we've had in the U.S. We've talked briefly, and you touched in your presentation, about taking the education materials and making sure that we have those available in multiple languages. And I was so pleased to hear not only that you're a writer, but savvy in translation. And I think that there's some great opportunity to evaluate and assess the potential of what these educational materials look like. And I'm not volunteering you nor dictating process, but you two should talk.
Can I add a consideration? I think that, right, yes. Our strength is the close alliance between physicians and patients community. As rightly point out Shane, now 15, 20 years ago, we really did not imagine in Italy a so strong alliance with patients. But now, for instance, the example of Italy, for Alpha-1 antitrypsin, there is a very, very strong alliance. We are really friends among physicians and patients. My best friend is really, I'm not joking, is Nuccia. We communicate very well and very much, and for instance, we have in Italy the so-called, in an English name, Info Alpha Days, that are a unified meeting among patients and doctors all together and all speaking about. And really I feel that is our strength to realize the objective with the Italian health system that, of course, as many other systems, is very complicated and bureaucratic.
We started our association 4 years ago, and what we did to make awareness between the medical community is we did some sort of road trip. We go to hospitals. We go to the nurse, to the person that helps patients with respiratory exercises. I don't remember the name. Yeah, rehabilitation. And then we go to the lung specialists. We leave our brochures, our books, a poster to put in the hospital, on a waiting room in the hospital. And we leave our contacts and we made an agreement with the lab, and every person that asks us about Alpha1 and how they can make the test, we send them to the lab, and they do the test free of charge there. So that really helps us. You know, doctors share our documents with patients, and then they come to us. And we started last year with the lung specialists, and now we are going to start with the pediatricians, and then possibly with the dermatologists. But it was a good way to start like that, and now I think that more lung specialists in Portugal know about the disease and they test it. Other thing that we did a protocol with the Lung Foundation, and now they test the patients with COPD. They test it for Alpha1. So I think it's a good way to start.
So my question is for Laura, in particular. Here. Hi. So in the last few days, we heard a lot about new promising approaches for new therapies for Alpha1. And one of the problems we're obviously now faced with augmentation therapy is the fact that these therapies satisfy the regulators, so they will hopefully get regulatory approval, but as we've just heard, reimbursement is a completely different ballpark and has to be approached on a national basis. So where are we in terms of regulators and HTA bodies from different countries actually working together to define the criteria for clinical trials before they start that will satisfy not only regulators but also HTA bodies, because HTA is a relatively new thing, and a lot of drugs that now come to market may not have known at the time when they designed clinical trials what requirements HTA bodies would have had in order to tick their boxes in order to get an easier deal with reimbursement. Is there anything you can tell us?
Yes. Okay, Sandra, you always put the finger in the spot. Actually, well, there are two different things here. One is that some things are beyond the control of anybody because they can change. And as you know, recently in UK, they have decided not to pay for 10 new anti-neoplastic treatments because of budget reasons. So even though, you know, at the beginning the opinion was good, even from the HTAs, but at the end, I mean, there was not enough room for considering that the benefit that these therapies will bring to the patients was enough to justify the price paid for that. So these things can change. What we try to do, we do have joint meetings with the HTA bodies. There is the European it's European working group. It's not really, it has a legal mandate, but it's called EUNETA. It's the European Network of the Health Technology Assessment. So it's where the countries try to work together on these things. And at the EMA, as much as we can, we try to have joint meetings early during the scientific advice procedures. So while we are advising companies on how to build trials, in some cases, but not for all our procedures, we do this together already with the HTA, because you are right. I mean, if certain endpoints, like what I was mentioning before, hospitalizations or, life expectancies or whatever you would consider for that specific disease and that specific medicine relevant as an endpoint for everybody, but in particular for reasoning on cost effectiveness, is not necessarily what you would be looking at for a trial just to prove the efficacy of a drug per se. Or maybe you would do it, but you would give it less importance to it. Or in general, regulators, for example, we don't care if a product reduces hospitalization or not. We look at whether it cures the patient or improves the health of the patient. So that's more of a, public health reasoning of somebody who has to provide, like I said before, the health to the whole country and pay for everything, not just for this single disease. So we try to do this as much as we can, but I think there's certainly more to be done in this. Also, starting even with the clinicians and the investigators to maybe to start thinking about these endpoints already when they advise companies when they are preparing their trial designs.
I think the problem is that the requirements for HTA bodies seems to be somewhat of a moving target depending on how much budget is in the kitty for healthcare, which is something that obviously changes with, you know, new governments post-elections and so on.
Yes. I mean, these are reasons that go beyond what we can do. As you well know, this is European politics. So, as you well know, in Europe there has been a lot of resistance, of course, to do healthcare things together because of budget reasons. Every country have their own healthcare system, so there have been some initiatives, and one of them is the Directive on Cross-Border Healthcare that try to bring all these type of things, not only the HTA, but all these type of things a bit closer. Also try to make reimbursement for something, you know, some treatment that you can get in a country, not in your country, easier. But of course, this is still a long road. And this is certainly something also where the Patients Association can lobby for with the European Parliament. You know, there's really a lot behind this in terms of healthcare policy that still needs to be done.
Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, Bell Orchard from New Zealand. And I want to go back to the registries again. I think we made the case yesterday for the importance of quality and comprehensive registries. But I guess the concern that I have is that certainly in New Zealand, the gatekeepers of those registries are the physicians. They're the ones that register us, patients. And sometimes they don't do it. They're not motivated to do it. So I think the registry is only as good as the physicians who are actually engaged enough to be motivated enough to actually put us on the register. So I'd like to have a sort of conversation about how we can sort of square that circle a bit and make sure that diagnosed patients are on a registry somewhere. How can we actually accelerate that? Because in New Zealand, I mean, I was diagnosed 10 years ago and I found I wasn't on the register. I didn't know that I wasn't until I asked the question. I assumed that I was. So I guess one way is for patients to actually refer themselves to a register, or else for physicians to actually encourage each other through peer pressure to put patients on a register. So are there any good case histories or models of actually how we do really strengthen the value of those registers?
That's a great question. I'll take the first stab, but I know that that Ken and others here have experience with the type of registry that you're talking about. There are a number of different models for registries, and they have trade-offs. In the US, our current registry, the patient is the one that enrolls themselves in the registry and provides the data that goes into the registry. And that is great for a motivated patient to get themselves into a situation where they're participating in research and things like that, but has the disadvantage that often, I think sometimes erroneously, it's assumed that patient-reported data is somehow not as high quality as data that comes directly from a physician or a physician's record. So the European and Canadian model is to have the physician put all that information into the registry. And if you happen to be seeing a physician that is, actively participating in a registry, that's great. But it's not so good if you live in a town where the doctor that's taking care of your Alpha-1 doesn't have that commitment to making sure every one of their patients gets in the registry. So there are trade-offs, and I happen to think that we're going to need to have some model that's halfway in between those two, that a patient can enroll themselves or the physician can enroll the patients, and the data comes from different places. When we all live in the perfect world, that we're all striving for, where data from medical records can be yours and follow you wherever you go, and you can dictate where that data goes to. There should be a time when you can make an enrollment in a registry and also give permission for your data to be sucked into that registry so that all the data is as consistent as possible, and you've given your personal permission to be involved in that registry.
Sorry. Sorry. Go ahead.
I am concerned about the same problem, getting patients signed onto our registry. And one of the tools that I mentioned, I think briefly when I spoke yesterday, was using laboratory reports, genotype, phenotype reports that are positive for a severe deficiency, and listing the contact information for a registry so that at least physicians are aware. And a reasonably conscientious physician who's not a specialist, who doesn't know a lot about Alpha-1, would likely or plausibly follow up on that. I think it would help if the registries gave back to individual patients and physicians. Charlie isn't with us on the panel today, but yesterday he mentioned that from his registry there's a quarterly newsletter, and I think that's the sort of thing that encourages patients to go there. And if you knew other alphas and you got the newsletter and they didn't, they'd probably start asking why and would consider signing up to the registry. But my last pitch is for folks in this room to make sure that your patient organization is closely attached to a registry and is doing everything it can to make sure that patients are registered. It's a way that keeps the Alpha community strong in whatever nation it is. And it's been a very valuable resource to have a registry in Canada. And I think we should take every opportunity to make sure that every known Alpha patient, if at all possible, has the opportunity to be in a registry.
Can I just add? There was an initiative from Eurodis some time back to encourage different countries to have their own national registry for rare disease. So Spain actually did take that up a few years ago, and that is for patient-reported. It's basic data, but it's patient-reported for them to be enrolled. So the individual associations can encourage their members to be active. Additionally, we did work on an initiative where the sub-registry for AIR in Spain, Redat, also, we made up an integration plan so that their data could also go into the Spanish Alpha-1. And also from the patient association, at that particular point in time, we took into consideration creating our own registry, anonymous registry database to complement. So we could have got 3 streams of data coming in, and by that kind of mechanism, we could actually encourage to build the registry much stronger. Unfortunately, for particular reasons and political reasons, etc., it didn't go any further. But I would suggest that you meet with the people who are more responsible for the registry, and you look at mechanisms, ways that you could actually promote and encourage the growth of the registry in the best way you can. It's a complicated business for anybody in the best situation, but anything you could do that could stimulate that, I would suggest it was very worthwhile.
I have something to say. Actually, in Europe, we are debating registries all the time for rare diseases also. And the most important problem, beyond the fact you need to be registered in the registry, is the longitudinal collection of the data. Because you have to understand that when you are in a registry, basically what you can do, what the physicians can do, what the people who analyze the data, whoever they are, can do, is to get a snapshot of the population, to say how many people are sick in this area, what are their characteristics, are they PZZ, are they P null or PI null, whatever, how many we have, what is their lung function, so okay, we can get this type of information. But when you want information, and we can look retrospectively, so when the patients are enrolled in the registry, we can get a little bit of their history. But of course, there is something there in epidemiology we call recall bias. So, you might have some documents of your spirometries or liver tests or other things, but other things about your symptom you will have to tell. So there is a lot of limitation to the information you can get with this data. So it's very important for registries to try to have a good quality collection of longitudinal data. And that is very difficult. It's very difficult because, as you say, physicians often do not have the time to do this. And even when they do, there is a problem of sustainability. Who's paying for this all this time to be sustained? These are problems that we know. There are a number of solutions that people are thinking. Some of them are, to use these registers on ad hoc studies so that you can be paid on that for a number of years, or patients can help funding part of that whenever they can, or there's not really a complete solution yet, but we are welcome to any type of idea and input on this. But yes, I think the problem of the longitudinal collection of data for the information is it's important to have about the history of the disease and the effects of treatments is very important, and we are still not very good in that.
Thank you very much. A little bit of housekeeping. As we switch back and forth on mics between the panelists and the audience, there is a little bit of a delay. So as you ask your questions, what I'm going to ask these panelists to do is perhaps repeat it, the first one to handle that. So I appreciate taking that on. Certainly there's more questions. Great.
Hi, Tim Prost. I noticed that our professor, Dr. Christ, has been sitting there silent, so I want to make sure we have a question for him. We are now becoming what I'll call aging hippies or aging alphas, and as we age, and as those of us who have had the privilege of having augmentation, and we are living longer, we then now start turning back to the real essence of Alpha-1, which is the liver. And my question deals with how do we get to standards of care that deal both with the lung aspects of Alpha-1, but also the liver aspects of Alpha-1.
I tried already yesterday to explain that probably correcting the problems in the liver will not necessarily correct the problems in the lung. So I'm not pretty sure whether this story or the idea behind cell therapy to replace the diseased liver cells by healthy cells will really come true. Because this liver is so sick that at least the first infusion of cells will not survive. They will die after a certain time, and then at least you have to repeat the infusion of cells to improve the environment in the liver for the next infusion to integrate into this environment and to do what its job could be. But as far as I know, in case of Alpha-1, there has not been some effort to prove that really. But what we learned from hepatocyte transplantation, and this is a long, let me say, a long experience of more than 30 to 40 years, is that you have to repeat the infusions of cells. So that means that you have to be under current control what is going on with your liver, and you may expect that there, as long as the liver is going to improve, you have a good hope that the function these cells are believed to do will also improve the lung. So we have no experience in that, at least concerning AA1.
I'd also add that clearly one of the areas that biotech and pharmaceutical companies are concentrating on in Alpha-1 is liver therapies, liver correction therapies. And even though it seems like we speak a lot about the lung, because after all, we've had a treatment to prevent progression of lung disease for a while, and we've been desperately trying to prove that it's helpful and get that into the hands of patients that need it. We've never lost sight of the fact that this is primarily a liver disease. And that was true in the Alpha1 Foundation from its start in terms of where it spent its research dollars. That's been true in terms of encouraging companies to look towards targets in the liver of Alpha1 patients. And so I think that it's possible that the coming years will see a kind of a renaissance in interest in liver-directed therapies, as therapies that started out in the laboratory years ago are now coming to the point that they're starting to be used in patients in early trials. And so I think this is going to be a good time to talk about the liver over the coming years, because there's going to be a lot of concentration on the liver as the target.
And another thing we ought to just keep in mind, we're doing the natural history study of liver disease related to Alpha-1 in children in the U.S., funded by the National Institutes of Diabetes and Digestive Kidney Disorders, and the Alpha-1 Foundation is contributing to that effort. We've got over 357 alpha kids in that study, and it's really making some good progress and continuing to enroll in that. And on the adult side, we just launched a $2 million effort to map out the natural history of liver disease related to Alpha-1 in adults. And we have two arms, or two different studies going on parallel, 100 patients each, all having to have a biopsy, one longitudinal biopsy, one single biopsy. So that's going to provide a lot of information that we already have on the lung disease related to Alpha-1, but we need that natural history study completed. Tim, and I know you've already volunteered for that, but we need that natural history study done, and the alphas, your cousins in the States are all committed to make sure that gets finished this year.
And if I may, thank you, panelists, at the very base level, and Sandy mentioned that from the start of the research funding, there's little disparity in the number of trials between liver and lung, as well as the number of dollars spent. And that's not always highly visible, but I think at the very base level that maybe Tim was getting at, is in the United States, as we onboard our Alpha-1 specialists, they tend to be liver or lung. And part of the criteria and what we're moving towards is that a pulmonologist have basic liver experience of Alpha-1 and knowledge about it, and have a referring physician that they're comfortable with that's also tied into Alpha-1, if not one in their practice that is a CRC doc. So at the very base level of ensuring that the entire patient is attended to from both perspectives, liver and lung, and dermatologically, we do educate there and recommend that they have those cross-references.
I'm Gordon Cadogan with the Alpha1 Foundation. So I see we don't have a lot of time left, but what I wanted to ask, I'm overwhelmed by the amount, the number of things, the number of accomplishments we need to do in the future. So I'd like to ask each one of the panelists if they could accomplish one thing in the remaining part of this year to help Alpha-1s around the world, what would that be?
Start at the end.
Leave it to Gordon. Frank, you want to kick this off? Okay, so I will repeat the question from our esteemed Gordon Cadogan, who is epitomizes what the perfect patient engaged fundraiser, everything having to do with moving Alpha-1 forward, has asked the panel to do, is to pick the one thing that they think is going to be most important in moving our mission forward. So Frank, we'll start with you.
So, I think there's one thing which is really the most important thing, which is to get awareness in all countries. Where are the alphas? And our difficulties is there's a lot of countries where we'll find alphas and we will not have treatment right away. But of course, because we work in a quite synergic way, we also have to activate the plasma industry to follow up to Asia, to Africa, to other countries. But first of all, we have to put all our tools on Europe and on the patients we know, and on the countries we have to densify. Also, of course, in the United States, and the big thing is South America, which is on the first line of our priorities. And I think all the other issues will follow in 2-3 years, because I feel here's so much energy going on with motivated people, and I'm very optimistic that we will really do big steps.
Thank you, Frank. Elise?
I think for now, the first thing is to have treatment for all the alphas. You know, there is still countries, even in Europe, that patients doesn't have the augmentation therapy. So I think this for me is the most important thing right now. If they have treatment, they can wait for a cure. I hope so.
Thank you.
Well, from the work, from the job I'm doing now, actually, I have an objective for the end of the year, and I think we might get I've discussed with some people here from biotech companies and so on. I would like more companies to come to us for getting an orphan status for their products, particularly for the liver disease, and particularly for treatments that can really be like gene therapy, small molecules that can, inhibit polymerization, and all these type of approaches that are very preliminary in preclinical phases, so that we can start helping them to develop the products within the regulatory system as soon as possible. And I hope that a few of the ones that I've spoken with in these days will come before the end of the year to ask for this.
Thank you.
Two things. The first one is to perform diagnosis as soon as possible, because we have to remember that the deficiency is not a disease but a risk factor. So the objective is to know during childhood, during a young adulthood, to recognize the presence of Alpha1 antitrypsin with a dedicated national program. And the second objective is to begin as soon as possible the augmentation therapy, because I am sure that when there is emphysema, we have to begin augmentation therapy. We have not to wait too much time.
Two things as well.
We're overachievers.
Manageable, according to you. The global awareness campaign, because we've already started on that, so I'm hoping we'll definitely progress in that before the end of the year, and also to help the Latin American countries set up their own resource structure to begin to work there more effectively together.
Three things, no. I think the most important thing that we could accomplish in the next year would be to initiate newborn screening throughout the world for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. I think that's what would have the greatest impact on all the things that we're talking about.
So I can only liver, and I'm a basic researcher, and I have no big steps to do, but the one thing we want to have is to get our experiences into a clinical phase 1 trial. We are thus far that we could say, yes, we could be successful in that, because the experience with this type of stem cells we are working with is quite good already in other settings like skin repair or cartilage repair. So there is some safety records already available, and I think showing the biological effects of these cells in animal models will help us very much to contact the authorities for going further. And the point is that we need the money to get into the clinics, because we have only small money to do research and not for doing clinical trials.
I agree with all of my colleagues on everything to get it done yesterday. But I think the reality is we need to get RAPID published. We need to get those RAPID data approved by the EMA and, if possible, the FDA. We need to make certain that we utilize those data, translate them, if you will, format them so that we can all use them for advocacy, because with that, we'll have more awareness. With that, we'll have more acceptance by the healthcare provider community. With that, we'll get more reimbursement. And with that, we'll be able to start to organize more globally with specific information that absolutely, let's not let perfect get in the way of good, that absolutely establishes that augmentation therapy is efficacious. Those of us that are on it, have been on it for 25 years, swear by it. We know it anecdotally, but the data is there now. And we've got to get that accepted and published, and we have to use that with our marching orders, because everything else is dominoes from there.
We already know I've given up on the doctors, so if I have one lever to pull, it would be to have this story in every Sunday supplement or magazine in every country around the world. It seems to me the public knows about cystic fibrosis and has a great deal of sympathy. They know about Lou Gehrig's disease and have a great deal of concern, but they haven't the foggiest idea about alpha, and that there are people out there who lose lung function because they're genetically disadvantaged. And I think if that story gets out there, alongside the story that there's this very effective treatment and that there's just been a landmark study, it could produce some changes. It will galvanize the public, it will interest the physicians, those lazy layabout physicians, and it will engage the payers. We're going to make sure that it engages the payers.
Oh, goodness. Go. I want to thank Gordon for such an incredible question to wrap this all up with. Certainly, it is an honor to have such an esteemed panel up here and such commitment from each and every one of them. I also think that question, as well as these wishes of our panelists, lends nicely to the transition into our group meetings by country. Frank will explain how that is going to work in just a minute, but if I could close with this and plug my title of community engagement, there's not one of these wishes that these panelists made from all walks in Alpha1 that will be accomplished without the participation and engagement by all of you. So make no mistake, whether it's advocacy, detection, participation in research, Alpha1 kids, Alpha1 adults, liver disease, lung disease, educating physicians, finding allied healthcare workers, each and every one of you have a skill set that can really, really add to those efforts. So figure out what those are, find your passion, find what you love to do, and use it for the betterment of Alpha1 and our patient community. So Frank, if you would take us to the next step, and thank you, esteemed panelists.